So everyone in the Mythica community, I want to introduce you to my new friend this past year, Justin Coots, who is a Celtic scholar and a contemplative leader. He has been at the forefront of creating virtual online communities dedicated to contemplation and to reclaiming the roots of early Christianity that also are widely embracing of other contemplative traditions. And Justin, I think one of the things that fascinates me about you is how you have woven together in your own life these different strands. So you have done an enormous apprenticeship with Indigenous traditions, and you found yourself then drawn from moving from a Protestant orientation towards a deep ecumenical spirit, but really nourished by the Celtic tradition. So would you just say a few things about that? I'm picturing in my own mind, it's a Celtic knot of these different influences that has nature and ritual and Indigenous wisdom all woven together. So could you just speak for a minute or two about that in your own life?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I have a different sort of background than most people. I came from an eclectic hippie sort of world. I grew up Quaker, and my family are Quaker way back for many generations on my mom's side. And I grew up in a very traditional, unprogrammed Quaker meeting in rural Southern Ontario. We had the gray building with no pictures on it, and there were people with horses and buggies, and we sat in silence and the whole bit. But at the same time, my mom also was this sort of like pagan type person, and I grew up with books on Wicca all around us. And I grew up going to Indigenous ceremony. So my mom she's American, I'm Canadian, but I was born in Canada, she was American, and she spent a bunch of time with the Huichole people in Mexico and Southern California and stuff, doing the whole ceremony thing with them. And I grew up with that. So I grew up as a little boy smudging and praying with the peyote in my hands and all that kind of stuff. So I grew up in these kind of two worlds, which they weren't opposed to each other. The Quaker community that I grew up in is very open-minded, but they're very different despite being not opposed to each other. In my teens, I threw all that to the wind and became an anarchist punk rocker, and I was a nomad. And I lived on the side of the highway from about 15 to 20. So I lived a fully nomadic life for about 5 years. And then at the end of that, when I was 19, 20, I met an Indigenous elder at a place called Thunder Mountain in Northern Ontario, which looks sort of like the picture in your background there, actually. And it changed my life. It changed my orientation. It just grabbed me and brought me into a life of prayer and asceticism and service. And I dedicated my life to that place. And I spent about 10 years studying with him. At the beginning, it was pretty much just him that I studied with. And then he retired near the end of that period. And I spent time studying with a number of other elders and medicine people as well. We did a lot of fasting camps, a lot of Yuwipi ceremonies, a lot of different things.
But how did you find your way to Celtic Christianity, which is the heart now of so much of what you do?
Yeah, well, I had, with growing up with this sort of Wiccan thing as a kid, I always had this notion that I was a Celtic witch. I was told that from the time I was a child. And also just my dad's side of the family are very sort of more mainstream Protestant Scottish, but like, you know, we always had, there's the family crest on the wall back there that from my dad's side of the family. And so I grew up with a notion of being Celtic, but it was very specifically at a sweat lodge one time when I was at Thunder Mountain, and we were praying to our ancestors, which is sort of a routine sort of thing to do. And I had never really thought about it much in the years before that, but all of a sudden my ancestors came to me. And I could see them there in the lodge, and they said to me, you know, Justin, we're real people, and you should probably learn something about us if you're going to pray to us. And so I went, and I had no interest in Christianity at all at the time. And I tried to learn about sort of Celtic paganism, but I didn't find anything that really jived with me and what I was looking for. And eventually, through another sort of set of events, I found my way to the church and to preaching. And it was really after I had left the church. I was in seminary for a while, and I left. And it was then that I really sort of brought these things all together. And I said, well, wait a minute, Celtic Christianity fits all of these things that I love so much. There's, the nature element and all that stuff that I learned so well in the bush with my elder. And there's the gospel, which I, as much as I didn't really fit in the church, I loved the gospel and it just, it spoke to me. And the Quaker side too. I mean, when you read Pelagius, the Quakers are very, very Pelagian. They don't talk about that or know that, most of them, but they are. And so it kind of just brought everything together, and it felt like all of these different strands, like you said, of the Celtic knot were sort of weaving together and landed in this one spot. And so for the last couple of years, I've been kind of holed up in my house, just reading ancient and medieval texts and praying all the time, and that's where I'm at now.
Great. Thank you. I love that. And I love that part of your story has to do with things that seem to be opposites, that you would be in ceremony with indigenous traditions, with Native American elders, and be called by your ancient ancestors to go deeper into the Christian roots that are in the Celtic Islands. And this is a thread that I have seen in so many people, that I've known many people who they say they become reluctant Christians because they were on vision quests, and the last person that they would expect showed up, so that they would have a Christian saint or Francis of Assisi or Jesus himself or their ancestors saying, go to these roots. And that's something that you and I have in common, because at my grandmother's death, she came to me in a vision, and she had never been in a Christian church in my entire lifetime. She didn't even come when I was baptized. And she gave me this very clear message about going to Christianity and looking inside in the depth of my heart. And I think that that's something then that you and I resonate with the Celtic tradition, is this emphasis on listening with the ear of the heart. And that's been certainly the thread that I've been following. And that's the blessing thread of these pilgrimages that I'll be doing in this coming year, is this beautiful tradition that is not that widely known, that is part of the earliest roots of Christianity, that really has to do not with sin and judgment, but with awakening our capacity to listen with the ear of our hearts, to awakening our eyes to see with the eyes of our hearts, and to develop a way of beholding the world that is in harmony with nature, in harmony with the good, the true, and the beautiful. And, I'm calling that the blessing thread, because it's the thread that weaves throughout the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and certainly your field of study that we'll get to in just a minute, Pelagius. And yet it's a wide expanse that can hold contraries. That's one of my favorite chapters of your forthcoming book, is really pointing to this idea of how do we navigate our way in life and hold all that we are, and hold the sort of the messy imperfection of being human as a sacred thing in and of itself. How do we find that pathway? And your story is such a beautiful example of that, about, there's all of these turns, the twists and turns of you living by the side of the road, and then apprenticing with a shaman, and then finding your way into the truth of your own heart, and in that contemplative practice. And so out of that, what you've created with New Eden Ministries and your writing is a beautiful Celtic braid that welcomes in the totality of what speaks in the depth of that still small voice that whispers to you.